We go. Okay, so welcome everybody to our first, or actually our second Lebanon County NAACP meeting of 2024, and happy first day of Black History Month, everyone. Um, and welcome to our meeting. So, as part of our change in program here for 2024, we're going to try to offer programs at our general membership meeting, and this is kind of the inaugural one. So, we will see how it goes. Um, and I thought that given all the events that are going on, and in commemoration of Black History Month, that I would give a little presentation on Reconstruction and the making and the legacies of the 14th Amendment, which has been in the news. So what we have here on the screen are what I consider three of the most sort of reliable and useful books that I've found on Reconstruction, including one by beginning with one of the founders of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1936 published this magisterial um, volume, and I have my copy here. The cover looks a little different, on Black Reconstruction in America, um, which was really a pioneering look at Reconstruction. Then John Hope Franklin in the 1960s, who ended up being the president of the American Historical Association, an African American historian and scholar, wrote a magnificent short book. If you're going to read anything on Reconstruction, want a general introduction, I would recommend John Hope Franklin, Reconstruction After the Civil War. It's easy to read, very elegantly written, and really summarizes things beautifully. And then in the 1990s, or actually late 1980s, Eric Foner um, wrote this magisterial book on Reconstruction, which is still sort of stands the test of time and is the sort of the leading interpretation. And essentially is Reconstruction, America's unfinished revolution of democracy for all. Um, so here's a roadmap to the talk, just very quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about the continuing relevance of the 14th Amendment today, turn to what it actually says and what it doesn't say, broaden the scope and broaden the field to talk about the origins of racialized slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction within the broad sweep of American history, then narrow the focus down to a narrative of events during Reconstruction, this dozen or so years from 1863 or 1865 to 1877, talk a little bit about the legacies, and then we can open it up for Q&A. So why is this relevant? Why is the 14th Amendment relevant today? I pulled some headlines from the news, and I'm sure you're familiar with this whole controversy that is ongoing today about the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that essentially says that those who have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States government and have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution are no longer eligible to run or hold public office. I think it's next week that the United States Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments on Colorado Supreme Court's ruling that booted former President Trump off the primary ballot in 2024. So the Supreme Court is going to hear those arguments next week and has said it will rule by sometime in March. Also, Maine, the Secretary of State of Maine has ruled that former President Trump is not eligible to serve, and other states are doing the same thing, Illinois and others. So this is an ongoing question: is former President Trump eligible to serve given the terms of the 14th Amendment? And then the other reason why it's relevant today, you see in the lower left-hand corner, I pulled a headline: Donald Trump reiterates pledge to scrap birthright U.S. citizenship. Um, as you know it's part of the Constitution, and amendments are considered totally part of the Constitution. So you can't simply like issue an executive order or pass a law that says part of the Constitution is no longer valid. Um, but these are some of the reasons why the 14th Amendment remains particularly relevant today. And then I was actually heartened by this, that a series of 25 historians or specialists in the Civil War and Reconstruction have filed an amicus brief with the U.S. Supreme Court supporting the Colorado Supreme Court's removal of Donald Trump from the ballot. You can find this online. It's easy to find, and it's actually a pretty gripping read in terms of looking at original documents from the Constitutional Convention and from the period of Reconstruction about why the 14th Amendment is valid in this case. So this is an ongoing controversy. These are just some of the reasons why this is continues to be important. So moving on to the second sort of topic here, what the 14th Amendment says and what it doesn't say. 14th Amendment has 5 sections. We're going to go over them real quick. Section 1 says that anyone born or naturalized in the United States is automatically a citizen, right? So before this, there was no sort of set of criteria for what makes a citizen. 14th Amendment says if you're born here, you are automatically a citizen. It also takes this language of the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The Fifth Amendment applied that to the federal government. The 14th Amendment says states have to do the same thing. States have to have also due process of law. And then it also guarantees equal protection of the law. So that's just Section 1. Section 2 is we can kind of go over this quick. It basically your right to vote. That if a state tries to prevent someone from voting, then their representation goes down in Congress. That was just an effort to make sure that states were enfranchising freedmen, the ex-slaves. But it's Section 3 that is really the key here. And I have the actual language down below with the key phrases sort of highlighted. But in plain English, Section 3 says you can't hold public office or serve in the military if you've taken an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution and then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or if you've given aid or comfort to enemies of the United States, unless a supermajority, that is 2/3 of Congress, votes otherwise. So that's what's really at stake with this, this ongoing controversy with former President Trump. Let's take a minute and look at what Section 3 does not say. There's a little bit of background noise there. Somebody's got their if you would mute, that would be helpful. So it does not say that a person needs to be convicted of insurrection or rebellion in a court of law in order for this to adhere. And it also does not say that Congress needs to act in order to disqualify someone from the ballot or from public office. So in other words, this section 3, is self-executing. This is the original intent of its authors. And it will be very interesting to see how the United States Supreme Court rules, given that it is dominated by originalists who believe in going back to the original documents and the original text and looking at the original meaning of what the authors meant. It'll be, to me, it would be very difficult to argue that that Section 3 is not valid given the original intent of its authors. Sections 4 and 5, we can kind of go over quickly. The public debt is valid, and then former slave owners do not get any kind of compensation for emancipated slaves. And then finally, Congress has the power to enforce these provisions. It doesn't say Congress has to pass a law to enforce these provisions, but it says it can if it chooses to. So that's basically what the 14th Amendment says. So let's broaden the scope then, and let's zoom out to a 50,000-foot view and look at the past 400 years of American history. And here we have a chart. The red zone in the chart down below shows the period of racialized slavery in British colonial North America, beginning in 1619 in Jamestown and going all the way up to 1865 in the 13th Amendment. And then the yellow zone shows the era of Jim Crow, of legally mandated segregation of the races, which was overturned in 1954 by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education, based on the 14th Amendment, and then the period of relative freedom. This is kind of an oversimplification in some ways, because if I were to do this and draw it on my own, I would have like a 12 or 15-year period of Reconstruction, when Black men in the South were voting and holding office and passing laws and so on, before Reconstruction ended in 1877 and Jim Crow began in the 1880s. And then I would also extend that yellow line maybe for about 20 years, because just because the Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that segregation was no longer the law of the land, it took about 20 years to actually be implemented. So it wasn't really until about the mid-1970s that there was no longer de facto segregation and de facto Jim Crow in the United States of America. And some would argue that it kind of still continues in some ways. So the origins of the 14th Amendment and all of this and the Civil War and Reconstruction is in 2.5 centuries of racialized slavery and this growing sectional divide between North and South. And then another point that I think really merits emphasizing is the Civil War and Reconstruction need to be understood together. And they're very often taught this way in college courses where there's a course on Civil War and Reconstruction because they're so integrated, you can't really take them apart. So the short version of what happened in Reconstruction and its aftermath is the South lost the war but won the peace with Jim Crow and the maintenance of white supremacy in the South through Jim Crow and racial terror and sharecropping. And the emergence of this lost cause narrative, which is still very prominent today. You still hear lots of echoes of it. Only most recently, when presidential candidate Nikki Haley was asked what caused the Civil War, she sort of talked, in terms of this lost cause narrative. It wasn't really so much slavery that caused the Civil War, it was government overreach and so on. So, what is this lost cause narrative of Civil War and Reconstruction? Well, according to this narrative of the lost cause, the Civil War originated as a defense of states' rights. It was a way to protect a struggle to protect Southern heritage and Southern ways of life against Yankee aggression. That slavery was a regime of benevolent masters that was sort of teaching useful skills to the enslaved. And then Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War became a series of tragic mistakes, with black men gaining the vote and then oppressing whites in all kinds of various ways, and including sexual violence against white women. You have Northern carpetbaggers coming down and lining their pockets as they're getting elected to office, and pocketing the hard-earned monies of those who are paying taxes. Union troops occupying the South, stealing, taking the property of former planters and other whites and giving it to the poor. This whole lost cause narrative found real expression in a classic 1914 film by D.W. Griffith called Birth of a Nation. I don't know how many of you have seen Birth of a Nation. It's a horrifying portrayal, but it's one of the most important films in American history. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do that. This lost cause narrative also found expression when Woodrow Wilson wrote in the Atlantic in 1901. The Atlantic magazine in 1901 devoted an entire issue to the issue of Reconstruction. And Woodrow Wilson offered the first essay in that series in the Atlantic. And so his expression of what Reconstruction was all about here, I think, is aptly expressed in this quote that I have on the screen here. This is Woodrow Wilson, future president of the United States, president from 1913 to 1920, for 2 terms through the Great War. 10 years after he wrote this, he became president, 11 years. An extraordinary and very perilous state of affairs had been created in the South by the sudden and absolute emancipation of the Negroes. And it was not strange that the Southern legislatures should deem it necessary to take extraordinary steps to guard against the manifest and pressing dangers which it entailed. Here was a vast, laboring, landless, homeless class, once slaves, now free, unpracticed in liberty, unschooled in self-control. Think about this characterization: unschooled and self-control. That's really problematic. I mean, if you're an enslaved person, one of the things you really know about is self-control. Never sobered by the discipline of self-support. Drives me crazy. Never established in any habit of prudence, excited by a freedom they did not understand, exalted by false hopes, bewildered and without leaders, and yet insolent and aggressive, sick of work, covetous of pleasure, a host of dusky children untimely put out of school. The Negroes were exalted, the states were misgoverned and looted in name until, and I can't quite see that because it's obscured by my screen, but until the real citizens, the white citizens, regain power. So this is Woodrow Wilson writing in the Atlantic in 1901, expressing at least part of this lost cause narrative. So now so that's kind of in the broad sweep of American history. Now let's zoom in in section 4 here on a more narrow narrative of events from the middle of the Civil War, 1863, up to the end of Reconstruction in 1877. As you know, the Civil War was the bloodiest war in American history, on the magnitude of 620,000 men killed, around 2% of the U.S. population. In the midst of the war, as the war is unfolding, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. It finally became clear to Lincoln that fundamentally this war was about slavery. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, but in fact, this proclamation did not free a single slave because it only applied to those parts of the Confederacy not with no Union troops, and it did not apply to the 5 border states of what were they? Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Tennessee, and then West Virginia when it split off from Virginia. So it didn't apply to the border states. It applied only to the Confederacy, but there are no troops, Union troops in the Confederacy. So in practice, it didn't free a single slave, but it had enormous sort of symbolic resonance. So the Emancipation Proclamation, at the end of that year, Lincoln issues his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, which basically says that if you take an oath of loyalty to the Union and you accept the supremacy of the Union government, that you will be amnestied of all crimes. So this was meant for military leaders, for political leaders, for anyone who engaged in rebellion. It is a way to try to mend together and knit together the nation back together again. As the war was coming to a close, it was clear the Union was going to win in early 1865. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau as a way to deal with the tens of thousands of what were called contraband of these freed slaves that had no land and no work and no, sort of ways to support themselves. So in terms of schooling and clothing and food and medical care and so on. So the Freedmen's Bureau became this really important part of Reconstruction. And there's an enormous amount of documentation associated with the Freedmen's Bureau. So the war ends, as you know, at the courthouse in Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, when General Lee surrenders. 6 days later, President Lincoln is assassinated, and Vice President Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency. Tail end of that year, the 13th Amendment passes in December, finally emancipating slaves and ending slavery formally in the United States of America. And then as Congress in early January 1866 passes the nation's first civil rights bill. Well, Andrew Johnson didn't want to see the emancipation or civil rights extended to Black Americans, so Johnson vetoes the bill. Congress overrides Johnson's veto, and this titanic struggle begins between the presidency and Congress. Johnson's plan, Johnson's vision, is this kind of lenient restoration, with no Black civil rights, no Black political rights, to readmit the Southern states as quickly as possible. So summer of 1865 into 1866, President Johnson issues thousands, actually tens of thousands of pardons to former Confederates. And it became this big sort of corrupt business. If you paid a certain amount, you could get pardoned. And so it was just this, and the Northerners are infuriated because, why did we fight this war with hundreds of thousands of people dying, 4 bloody years of conflict, if we're just going to forgive and just let things go back to the way they were? Meantime, Southern states begin passing these black codes that are imposing all kinds of restrictions on the freedmen in terms of property ownership, right to vote, on juries, et cetera, vagrancy laws, trying to reinstitute some kind of slavery. Meantime, white militias form from the disbanded Confederate army. They still have their arms. They still have their desire to maintain white supremacy. So in the words of John Hope Franklin, 1866 in the South was open season on Negroes. In April of 1866, Thaddeus Stevens, as you know from Pennsylvania, right here in Lancaster, lionized as one of the leaders of a radical Republicans and radical Reconstruction. Thaddeus Stevens and the Republicans proposed what eventually became the 14th Amendment. Meantime, summer of 1866, there's a series of race massacres. A big one in Memphis, 46 African Americans killed and hundreds wounded. And then in New Orleans, big race massacres, again, mobs of whites in collusion with the local police, kind of standing by, and white office holders colluding as well. 34 blacks killed, dozens more injured. So this is the context in which this is unfolding. So the Republicans in Congress are outraged. They win the result. They win the elections of November 1866 in a landslide. They dominate the Senate. They dominate the House. And the result is a period of radical Reconstruction in 1867, 1868. This is one of the most contentious periods in American history. And the nation is facing three fundamental questions. Who's going to actually rule the South? Are the defeated ex-Confederates going to kind of resume power in the South, or will it be the victorious North? Who's going to rule in Washington, D.C.? Who has supremacy? Is it Congress or is it the president? And what are the meanings and dimensions of Black freedom in America in the wake of 250 years of racialized slavery? These are some really fundamental questions that the nation is confronting during this period of radical Reconstruction. So this is kind of the pattern in 1867, 1868, that Congress, dominated by the radicals with Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and others, passes bills, the president vetoes, and then Congress overrides their veto. And we have here listed the first and second and third and fourth Reconstruction Acts through 1867 and 68. And on the right-hand side is an image of sort of anti-Reconstruction, anti-radical Reconstruction propaganda. The radical platform, Negro suffrage is the only issue. So in 1868, then the House votes to impeach President Johnson. And when it goes to the Senate, we now know how impeachment works because it's happened a lot in recent years. The House impeached, and then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate failed to convict President Johnson by just one vote. So he remains president, but he's the first impeached president in American history, not to be the last. And then in July 1868, the 14th Amendment is finally ratified. And in February, and I can't quite read that because it's the bottom. So, okay, so then by 1870, then, 1870 is the 15th Amendment, which grants the vote to Black men, not to women, but to freed men. So then from 1870 on, Reconstruction begins to lose steam. The North is losing interest. There are other issues that are on the rise of tariffs and industrialization and immigration and so on. Southern intransigence and militias and the KKK continues. And so this image here we see on the right-hand side of worse than slavery with the KKK and the White League, that this is the situation in the 1870s. And then finally, in 1876, there was a contested election. It's very close. Rutherford B. Hayes ends up gaining the presidency, but there's a compromise that Congress institutes or agrees to. The compromise of 1877, which means that the Union troops now will be withdrawn from the South, and the Southern states are redeemed. They're back in the Union, but they are now basically being governed by the same Confederates that were pardoned and that launched the Civil War to begin with. And that's when Jim Crow laws begin to emerge by the early 1880s, and especially middle to late 1880s. All these restrictions on property ownership and segregation of the races and schooling and transportation, and this condition of not exactly slavery, but not freedom either. This is also the period then when Confederate monuments begin to be built. We're seeing them dismantled today, at least some of them, but this is the period of Confederate monuments going up, 1890s, early 1900s, 1910s, lionizing the heroes of the South who are, again, part of this lost cause narrative. A key moment comes in 1896 when the United States Supreme Court rules in Plessy v. Ferguson that Jim Crow laws are constitutional, that separate but equal, so-called, is the law of the land. So the Supreme Court ratifies Jim Crow laws in this landmark case of 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson. So moving on to what are some of the legacies then of the 14th Amendment. The NAACP is formed in 1909, as you know. W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the principal founders, and one of their primary goals in the first 3 or 4 decades of the existence of the NAACP was their anti-lynching campaign, their anti-racial terror campaign. But they also had a legal dimension, and they were working through the courts, and through a long, sort of complex series of events we can't get into. In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate is inherently unconstitutional, and it overthrew Plessy. So for 58 years, Plessy was the law of the land. Finally, in 1954, the Supreme Court overturns it. But again, it takes about 20 years for it to be actually implemented in practice. In 1964, Congress, under Lyndon Baines Johnson as president, passes the Civil Rights Act, which includes the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Voting Rights Act in 65, which are, I think, some of the most important legislation in all of American history. Roe v. Wade in 1973 was based on the 14th Amendment, which, as we know, was just overturned after 49 years. In 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges, the same-sex marriage based on the 14th Amendment. And now we have Colorado and Maine and Illinois and other states attempting to disqualify Donald Trump from the 2024 election. So these are just some of the most prominent, legacies of the 14th Amendment. I have here a little image on the ACLU, on the Supreme Court, and the 14th Amendment. And the ACLU, I think, is a really allied organization with the NAACP. We fight and struggle for a lot of the same goals. And these are just some of the most prominent. So that's basically the end of my little talk here. For learning more, again, the top 3 books that I would recommend, starting with John Hope Franklin. W.E.B. Du Bois, it's a really thick, dense read, as is Eric Foner. John Hope Franklin is much more sort of accessible. And then Bruce Levine on Thaddeus Stevens and the Civil War. And then The Atlantic actually just had an entire issue, December 2023, 2 months ago, to reconstruct the nation, learning from America's most radical experiment, an entire issue devoted to Reconstruction. And just parenthetically, actually, David Blight has a piece in here where he has a different speech by Frederick Douglass, an 1866 speech by Frederick Douglass, that I think we might actually change the Frederick Douglass community oration this summer to no longer do his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," but his speech of 1866, which seems really appropriate in this time as we look forward toward the 2024 election. We look forward, I think, with great trepidation, actually, about what that election might bring. And then there's also tons of online resources, and I just put some here. I'll be happy to make this available to everybody as a PDF file, and the links and so on. So that's pretty much it in terms of my presentation. I hope I didn't go too far over the line here. I know it's a lot to squeeze into 20 to 30 minutes. So why don't we call it the end and see if there are any questions?
That was awesome. Why don't we learn more of this in high school and college? Or they didn't teach it very well.
I wish I knew, Pat.
Gosh.
Well, I studied history, and there's stuff I'm learning every day. It helps to specialize, but no one's ever going to know everything, and that's why presentations like this are great. I think I'll probably forget a lot of the facts, in the next few months, but there's going to be some things that I didn't know already that are going to stick with me. So thank you, Michael.
You bet, Scott. Yeah. My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's wonderful. Are you going to upload this in the Google Drive that we can?
You bet. I think we're recording now. I'm not really even sure. But yeah, I'll be happy to turn it into a PDF file. And if it is being recorded, if people think it's worth watching, I'll be happy to post it.
Absolutely. I have a question.
So any questions about any of this stuff? Yeah, Pat.
Well, I have a question. So what is the origination of is this part of the 14th Amendment, or the origin of like so much of what I see going on in politics today is state rights versus federal rights, with the states kind of wanting um, to overtake and set their own
Yeah,
set their
actually,
own
that
laws
goes
and
back to
criteria.
that goes back to the foundation of the republic, right? That we are a federal system, and so the balance between state sovereignty and federal sovereignty, all through the 19th century, the so-called antebellum period from say 1800 to 1860, there was a long string of conflicts precisely over this question of states' rights versus federal rights. So this has been an area of conflict and tension and struggle. Um, you think of the Missouri Compromise and the nullification crisis of what was it, 1820 or so, where I think it was North Carolina was arguing that no, we are supreme. We
Uh-oh.
have, our state laws supersede federal law. And so, these struggles have been going on since the beginning of the republic, and they're going on today, like in Texas, with the Supreme
Yeah.
Court saying the federal government is authorized to dismantle this razor wire, and the state of Texas saying no, we are being invaded, and so our laws supersede federal law. So we're seeing the same sort of conflict, and it's not just in the United States, right? Every nation state that has a federal system has this same conflict between the federal authority and more local authority. So it's just an enduring feature of the American Republic.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Could you just say a word about how the 14th Amendment is connected to Roe versus Wade?
Yeah, it was my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but that it can be read into the 14th Amendment, that the right to privacy, that I'm not sure if it is. I don't think it's the due process clause, but and I don't actually know which of the clauses of the 14th Amendment that the Roe was based on, but it could be the due process clause. But this essentially imputed or inferred right to privacy in the Constitution that is being contested by more conservative scholars and judges.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, so why don't we leave it there? And I'll be happy, if people have other questions or want to continue this conversation, I'll be happy to continue it in another venue. But since it's 20 minutes to 8 and we still have business to attend to, why don't I pull the screen back, pull the agenda back up, and we can kind of work our way through our agenda.
Mike,
Yeah.
before you start the agenda, are you going to stop the recording?
Yeah, let's see. How do I do that? Stop recording. I know how you do it. You press stop.